Well, good morning. It is time for us to get started with the next lecture. And even though there isn't a lecture immediately after this, Jared is up against lunch, so we do want him to get started as soon as possible, get his material in. It is my privilege this morning to introduce Jared Saltz. It's always a little bit dangerous to have one of the members of the Bible department introduce one of the other members of the Bible department because we know way too much about each other. Really get to know each other in a good way, working together, see the good, the bad, and the ugly, and a lot of the ugly. But we really do appreciate Jared being with us. He has been teaching with us for 5 years now. He's been working with the Lord's Church in Palmetto during that time. Jared did get his bachelor's degree here at Florida College, went on to get a master's from Amridge, and then a master's of philosophy from Hebrew Union, and then is completing his PhD at Hebrew Union as well. I think he's been working on that dissertation for 15 or 20 years now. It seems like it's been going forever. The students typically refer to him as almost Dr. Saltz. That's how they will refer to him. But what I really appreciate about him is his willingness to dig into the text and really make you think. I think every conversation that I have with Jared, I have an emotional reaction one way or the other to whatever he says, but it really does make you think about the text, and I hope that you will pay attention to what he has to say this morning as he talks to us about the wheat and the tares.
I don't know if we can say good morning or good afternoon or exactly where it is. Certainly, going up against lunchtime is a difficult position. How many of y'all are already just feel the rumblings, the desire for, you're like, look, if I was at church, we'd have been halfway to wherever you choose. I guess here in Tampa, it's Jason's Deli for some reason, but there we have it. But what we're going to be talking about is a parable. Surprise. And the parables are tough to teach in some ways because we know them pretty well, or let me rephrase that. The parables are tough to teach because we think we know them pretty well. We certainly heard of them frequently enough. I mean, if I were to ask for a show of hands about how many of y'all have heard a Bible class or a sermon or a series of sermons or a whole host of Bible classes on parables, I imagine everybody's hands would go up. In fact, if I said, hey, how about 2 or 3 or a dozen, most people's hands would probably stay up. But I think already, after just a few lectures maybe, we've probably noticed, as I have certainly noticed, this familiarity, if it doesn't breed contempt, can sometimes breed laziness. We think we know what they're all about, but as I consider the text, and as I consider the Gospels, and I consider the apostles, how often do they think they know what Jesus is saying, but they don't? Oh, now, Jesus, you're speaking clearly, and we really get what you're saying. What's he talking about? Have Jonathan up here shuffling across the stage and tell us what's really going on. And the question then is, if that's how they are, who do I think that I'm any different? How often are my ears listening but not really? And certainly that I think perhaps is the case with all the parables, and at least for myself, I've found it to be the case here in Matthew chapter 13, where we're going to be spending most of our time this morning. In Matthew chapter 13, as PJ already mentioned, you've got this collection of 7 parables, and most of them are about unexpected things, about growth or surprising, shocking even changes, especially that occur after time or even at the capital E end. So a tiny mustard seed grows into a large plant, a little leaven leavens an entire lump, and it's in this connection of growth and unexpected things happening in these kind of agricultural metaphors that Jesus tells the parable of the weeds in the field. And he begins there in Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed proper seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. The master's slaves came and said to the master, didn't you sow proper seed in your field? Why then does it have weeds? And he says, an enemy has done this. So the slaves responded, you want us to go and uproot them, right? But he said no, because then you would uproot the wheat while gathering the weeds. Instead, let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, uproot the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. And this parable of the weeds in the field, as the disciples call it, presents at first a seemingly simple story about why God allows the wicked to exist in a world while his kingdom is already at hand. And this parable seems simple at first to us because, as Edwin noted, it's one of the two parables Jesus gives us the explanation for. I mean, we get a full exegesis of the passage. And it doesn't matter who you're reading on this passage, whether you're going way back and reading some of the church fathers, or you pull a commentary off your shelf, or you listen to a sermon or a Bible class, you're probably going to run into the same thing. And that they're going to say, listen, in its context, especially for the first readers of Matthew, it's to allay concerns about the presence and nature of the kingdom in face of difficulties. So now that's settled, we can pack up, we can go and grab lunch, then go home and take a nap. That's certainly what I'm going to do later. But we've answered all the questions, right? We're done. It's all good to go. We have answered, solved everything. We've seen what Jesus has said. But when we read this explanation that Jesus gives, and we're going to read it in just one moment, notice there are a lot of things Jesus does not explain. And let's see if we can catch them as we read the explanation that occurs down in verses 36 through 43. The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of the kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, and then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom with their Father. And whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And as we think about this a little further, we might wonder why Jesus really even needed to give an explanation. Isn't the parable kind of straightforward? I mean, from the very beginning, when he's bringing up the kingdom of heaven, it tells us it's at odds with the kingdoms of the world. And he's talking about what's going to happen before the end of the world. And although it might not stand out exactly to us, but to all of his readers and all of his hearers, I should say, the language and the metaphors and the concepts that he's using are common to other texts of that time. Texts which were famous and everybody of that time knew, even if we wouldn't consider them canonical. Texts like 4th Ezra or 2nd Baruch or some of the Dead Sea Scrolls like Serach HaYachad or the Psalms of Solomon, they use this same terminology, the same language, a lot of times the exact same vocabulary. In other words, if you're listening to Jesus say this, you didn't have to be an exegetical genius to figure out that God permits the righteous and the wicked to coexist, sometimes indistinguishable from each other, but in the end, they will be separated into reward and punishment. But this clarity can conceal the fact that not everything has been interpreted for us. And indeed, that lack of information forces us, and I'm talking about us here, not just the us listening originally, to make some assumptions, primarily assumptions about what the motivation is of the enemy and of the slaves and of the master. So when we consider these three most important questions I think we're going to get to really get at the heart of this parable, there's a lot of questions that we need to ask. But historically speaking, where a lot of people have begun their inquiry is into this question about, wait, what about the weeds? What is going on with these weeds that are in the field? And this can kind of make some sense. If we understand what the deal is with the weeds, what they are, what they do, what their problems are, then we can kind of in a back-end way, figure out what the enemy is trying to do. And there are two kind of popular approaches. The first approach to understanding what's going on with the weeds is understanding that the enemy, who we know, of course, is Satan, he is sowing the crop with a poisonous weed. A poisonous weed, people who are, I'm not a botanist, so I've actually did read one thing by a botanist, but I am taking their word for this on this. That's not my bag of tricks in any sort of way. But they say, well, this type of weed is of a genus called Lolium tumentulum, and can cause a low-grade narcotic effect. It is poisonous, and if you eat enough of it, you can get pretty sick. And if you eat enough of it like you're an animal, it can kill the animals. And so they say, look, it looks a lot like wheat. We find it in this area of the world. It's actually still a problem today. And so they say the reason then that the enemy sows these seeds into the field is to harm the master and the slaves who eat them. But others, like a person you might have heard of, D.A. Carson, he's like, well, that's not really makes sense because this weed, this darnel, it's not that poisonous. For humans, the amount that you would eat, you'd get a headache, but that's it. And instead, they would suggest this approach that, well, the purpose then is not to harm the master or the slaves, but the wheat. Its roots of this darnel entangle with the others, and they're stronger. They have a better root system. They steal nutrients from the wheat, and they make the crops weaker. Modern studies, and it's difficult to know exactly how well you can map these onto ancient studies, but modern studies of wheat fields that have been contaminated with darnel lose somewhere between 17 and 62% of their crop. That's a lot. Especially when we recognize, of course, in Jesus' understanding that the wheat are his people. And if you take this view, which is, best as I can tell, is the most popular one, then you can explain the enemy's motives, but you can't explain the master's choice. Because if this darnel steals from and kills off the crops of God's people, why on earth is God just letting him go and run amok? It's like, no, let him keep on stealing everything. Let him keep on taking everything. Then at the end of the age, we'll separate everything out. There's other small questions you would ask about this passage. Some people are like, well, is the enemy's action realistic or is it hypothetical? And people have always tried to answer this. Some people would appeal to a 6th century AD Justinian Roman law that talks about the punishments. Other people are like, well, one time I was a parish priest in 18th century England and someone sowed some seed in my field. And although these are interesting and although maybe the better questions to ask are what's exactly the field here in the world? Is it talking about the church in general, where some of us who think that we're Christians we think we're wheat, are really weeds? Or others would say, well, is this talking about in ourselves, that there are weeds that we have to get out of our lives and have to fix our things? And these are important questions. I think that these questions miss the most important question that we need to ask of this parable. Because as intriguing as the botany that Jesus described is, and the frequency or the reality of this practice of sowing seeds on top of someone else's fields is, the most important conceptual framework for Jesus' listeners and Matthew's first listeners was not the botanical genus of a weed, nor was it 6th century Roman law, and it certainly wasn't 18th century English customs. It was the law of Moses. And once you say that, then all of a sudden you realize, wait a second, there is a law in the Bible about sowing 2 types of seed in a single field. Now, as soon as I say that, for most of y'all, maybe even all of y'all, you're like, oh yeah, I remember there's something about that. But for some of you, or maybe even a lot of you, they might not. And that's because few portions of the Old Testament are as foreign to us and to modern Christians as is the legal material, particularly those areas dealing with cleanliness and the mixture laws. I mean, those of us who have not died in February on our, Bible reading plan because we hit Leviticus, cast the first stone, we understand. However, the more that one looks into these laws, even of those considered most irrelevant or most useless, and those are sometimes the terms thought and sometimes even the terms said about this kind of stuff, the more we study these, I think the more we recognize that they are attempting to reflect God's creative ethic in their own disordered world. Because think about it. In creation, God had created order from chaos. And mixing seed, whether in your field or in your animals or in your clothing or in your harvest, was viewed as a return to chaos, an attack on God's character and creative genius, because God had created things in Genesis 1 to give birth according to their own kind. In Genesis 1, God sets up boundaries for days and for seas and for waters and for lakes and for seasons and for animals, and everything is according to its own kind. So why on earth are you sowing two types of seed in a field? Why are you creating hybrids? That doesn't look like what God does. And so we have two really important laws in the Bible. And one comes from Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 9 through 11, and it states, "Do not sow in your field with two kinds of seed, lest the full yield be dedicated, both the crop from the seed which you purposefully sowed, as well as the vineyard itself. And do not plow your field with an ox and a donkey together. Do not wear cloth of two kinds of product, linen and wool mixed together." And the other one comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, "Keep my statutes. Do not let your cattle breed with a different kind of animal. Do not sow your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear a garment of cloth made from two types of materials." And once we hear that, we're like, oh yeah, this is clearly a relevant passage because it's talking about sowing two kinds of seed in the field. And if something's talked explicitly about in the Bible, well, to say what I think we all believe, the Bible is its own best commentary. Now, both of these laws provide for the same three areas where mixtures are forbidden: animals, land, and clothing. But they're not exactly the same. I mean, for example, Deuteronomy talks about animal use, whereas Leviticus discusses animal breeding. Deuteronomy is talking about a vineyard, and Leviticus is talking about a field. They have a few other little discussions, but they're each rooted in that creation ethic where you do things according to its own kind. But we do have to ask a question of what these laws actually mean. In other words, we're like, okay, they're here. Don't sow seed. But why? I mean, that seems like a really important question. I mean, one of the reasons we ignore this material in the Bible, which makes up a significant portion of the law of Moses, of the Pentateuch, of the first 5 books of the Bible, is because we don't know what it means. We don't know what to do with it. And a lot depends on what these laws mean, on how you interpret the law in general. And in modernity, particularly among Christian interpreters, the first sort of approach is to try to make the law practical, right? To make it practical. This is why interpretations, well, that's why, Jews couldn't eat pork, because salmonella. And in which case I might ask, why did God just stop caring about Christians getting salmonella in Acts chapter 15? But, that's a whole different conversation. Or in these same conversations, they'll say, well, you can't have an ox and a donkey, working together on the same plow because the ox is stronger than the donkey and it hurts the donkey, and it's just a good practical advice. Or in this case, they're going to say, well, this is actually about sharecropping. And the reason you can't sow two types of seed in a single field is because it's less efficient. You have to sort the different seeds. You can't just go in and do everything, our sort of line model of doing everything the same way. But that doesn't fit either the realities of their situation, where in Israel's context, small, barely and often sub-subsistence level farms where efficiency didn't really matter, absolute productivity mattered. You're trying to eke every iota of usefulness out of land because otherwise you starved and you died. In this case, sharecropping is actually far superior. And you don't have to be George Washington Carver to understand that. Everybody in antiquity knew it too. So this isn't about a practical solution. And there's something else going on, and that is that this is not necessarily referring to the same person sowing two types of seed in his own field. It's actually talking about a different person sowing two types of seed in a field. One person sowing seed on top of another. And we can make this more clear when we compare the laws here in the Bible to laws in the cultures that surround the Bible. Talk to Tommy Peeler about lex talionis sometime, or ask him about the laws of the goring ox. He will regale you at length, and you're going to be, I know now more about that than I ever thought I knew I wanted to know, but now I want to know even more. Well, there's a law that comes from the Hittites, like Uriah in the Bible. And let me read it for you. This comes from Hittite Law Code 166 through 167. Tell me if you think this sounds familiar. If anyone sows his own seed on top of another man's seed, they will place the perpetrator's neck on a plow, and they will hook up two teams of oxen facing the opposite ways for them, and they will hook the man to the center, and they will send the oxen different ways, and thus the man will be put to death. And then the oxen will be put to death, and then the field will be burned. Sound a little familiar? Even in the Roman period, moving significantly farther west and a significant period later, you can find a similar situation in Justinian's Digest, where a person maliciously sows tares or wild oats on another person's crops in order to spoil them and receives a dangerous penalty. And these passages actually make it far more clear that that's the situation Jesus is talking about. Jesus sets before the crowds an interpretation that he gives the disciples later, where an enemy comes in and sows bad seed in the good field. And I think that having read this and having this in the back of our minds, we're ready to return to these major questions that are left unanswered by Jesus when we talk about that parable again. And that is that Jesus' audience, even if we aren't, would have absolutely been familiar with the laws in Moses' law about sowing multiple types of seed in a single field. And they know what it means, and they know what it requires. But we still may not know exactly what it means. Because as when we return to that question about Deuteronomy, when it gives the punishment, what exactly does it mean when it says that a field that has been sown with two types of seed must be dedicated? Dedicated here is the word that it uses in Hebrew. It's, if you know Hebrew, it's the term kadosh, which is the kind of the verbal form of the word you're probably more likely to know, the noun kadosh for holy. And it has a pretty broad sort of set of meanings that it can take. On the one hand, it comes from this idea of to make holy. So some people said, well, what it means here is this field is made holy. It's kind of removed from common usage. It's special treatment. And what you're going to do with it is it becomes kind of like the showbread that only priests can eat it. That this is removing it from common use. It's like if you got your field sowed with two kinds of feed, well, then you don't get it. It goes, and the entire thing is dedicated to the priest. The guy who sowed the field the first time doesn't get the food. The guy who sowed the field the second time doesn't get the kind of food. It all just is given to the priest. And you're like, well, that makes pretty good sense. But others, and I think that Tigay is right here. If you want to read a good commentary on Deuteronomy, Tigay is pretty good. He says it's not actually talking about the dedication of the field to the priests. That in this context, dedication means destruction of the field. And we have another hint here from another law in the Mishnah, which is the early Jewish kind of interpretation of what we see in the law. In Mishnah Kilayim 5:7, it says this: now, if wind blew the seed in front of him into a vineyard, Rabbi Akiba, a first century rabbi, you may have heard of him, if it has produced small shoots, he must turn the soil. And if it has reached the stage of green ears, he must beat them out. But if it has grown into grain, if the seed, the second type of seed, has grown into grain, notice what he says, it must be burnt down. Now, let me be very clear. We need to be careful whenever we use rabbinic material, even when using the earliest rabbinic texts like the Mishnah. Just because someone says, or whether it's reading in a commentary or anything else, well, Jewish tradition says that That doesn't always mean that that's relevant. A lot of Jewish tradition comes from far, the Talmud comes from the 9th century after Christ. That's a significant period of time. And even the earliest collection of Jewish texts, like the Mishnah here, it doesn't always go back to the time of Jesus or before. It's not codified until about 200 years after Jesus. But there are a few things with that kind of caveat in place that would suggest that we can use this particular text to help understand what everybody living in Palestine at the time, like Paul, raised and taught by the rabbis about what the law means, would work. And the first thing is that this actually receives a specific attribution to Rabbi Akiba. And as you go through rabbinic texts, you realize that most of those given specifically to Rabbi Akiba actually are pretty consistently early. And the second thing, and this is the more important thing, is that actually when we look through the Old Testament and look through what dedication means in the Bible, it's almost always connected to burning. It's almost always connected to burning. Think about it. At the Exodus, right? In Exodus chapter 19, verses 21 through 24, Sinai, which has been rendered holy, what's going on? What does it talk about? It's wreathed in flame. And God says, hey, anybody who comes onto the mountain that's not supposed to come onto the mountain, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be burned up. Because why? Because it is dedicated, it is holy, it is Kadash. When Nadab and Abihu, this is a passage we know well, in Leviticus chapter 10, when they bring to God something that isn't holy, that isn't dedicated, what happens to them? They're burned up. If we look at, the same sort of a situation with Korah's rebellion in Numbers chapter 16, remember when Korah brings strange fire that the Lord doesn't know? He brings these incense pans. They're not from the right family of Levites. They're not dedicated to God. What happens to them when they try to draw near to God? They are burned up. So God's presence is frequently linked to these twin concepts of holiness and of dedication and of fire. Remember Isaiah in chapter 6, when he sees the vision of the heavenly realm, what does he see everywhere? Smoke. Why is there smoke? Because in this case, at least, there was fire. And what does he think is going to happen to him? He realizes that when he's before God, he's not holy and he expects to be destroyed. But instead of course, being burned entirely up, God just takes a burning coal and puts it to his lips to cleanse him. But it's not just true in terms of this word and it's also true in terms of concepts. Think about it, in Leviticus chapter 27, verses 28 and 29, nothing that is devoted to the Lord out of anything he has, a man or beast or field, may be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is dedicated to the Lord, and nothing that has been devoted or promised to be devoted may be ransomed from destruction. Or a little bit later in Numbers chapter 21, Israel vowed to the Lord and said, if you will surely give this people into our power, this is the people coming into Canaan, then we will dedicate their cities to destruction. That same term, dedicate. Well, let me ask you, how did they dedicate Jericho or Ai or Hatzor to the Lord? It was by burning them up. And so, with this kind of in mind, I think it's fair to say, and y'all, obviously make up your own minds about this, throw your LeVar Burton Reading Rainbow, do this for yourself, kind of a concept. The kids are now too young to know about that, but some of you guys have watched that, fair enough. And I think then what is clearly the case, and hopefully it's clear for you too, is that what is going on here is that a field sown with two types of seed isn't just to be dedicated to the priest, it is meant to be entirely burned up. And so let's once more return to this parable that Jesus tells to Jews living in Palestine in the first century, who are helping to interpret these things, not just by knowing the law so well, but even helping interpret these things through rabbinic circles and rabbinic schools. And let's read this one more time. So in Matthew chapter 13, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed proper seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. The master's slaves came and said to them, Master, didn't you sow proper seed in your field? Why does it now have weeds? And he said, an enemy has done this. And the slaves responded, do you want us to go and uproot the weeds? But he said, no, because then you would uproot the wheat while gathering the weeds. Instead, let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, uproot the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my fire. Now, this one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. The reapers are the angels. And just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so too will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of the kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, and then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father, and whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. And now, with those concepts in mind, doesn't this ring a little bit differently? Jesus has identified many of the actors, but he hasn't identified the actions because his audience would have understood the actions without him making it clear. In other words, our questions are, why has the enemy sown tares in the field? And why do the servants ask to uproot them? And what do they suggest that they uproot? And why does the master do what he does? Some of this, the first parts of this would have been very clear to his audience, and they're going to speak through the actions of the slaves, as we're going to see in just one moment. So the most obvious and the easiest answer now, I think, for all of us to see is why the enemy does what he does. The devil isn't trying to weaken or kill the angels or Jesus by sowing poisonous seed in his field that he won't consume. Nor is the devil sowing bad seed in the field merely to damage the godly, whether by stealing those things which will nourish them or causing incidental damage when the weeds are removed, which, again, should be obvious since the master says, leave them until later. No, when we read this parable through the context of the law of Moses, through the context of Jesus' first century Jewish listeners, it becomes clear that the devil sows a second type of seed in this field in order to force God to destroy the field. And in the parable, Satan desires to force God to destroy the world, the righteous along with the wicked. Such has been his desire from the beginning, and many have been his attempts. I mean, this is the story of the Bible, isn't it? Think in Genesis chapter 3. Why does Satan come and tempt here Adam and Eve? Why does he bring about these curses among humanity, driving them from the garden? But because he wants to destroy what God has made good. Oh, in Genesis chapter 6, all of the sin that is brought about the world, so God is destroying that. Or in Genesis 18 and 19, the sin that causes him to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah in fire. Or in Exodus chapter 3, the sin of the golden calves, which breaks out against Israel. Or in Numbers chapter 13 and 14, when the people refuse to go into the promised land and they mostly die in the wilderness. Or in Habakkuk chapters 1 through 3, where sin has brought Judah to the brink of destruction, where they're going to be dying in fire and sword. Again and again and again, Satan's desire in contaminating us with sin is to try and force God's hand to destroy the righteous along with the wicked. That's who he is. That's what he does. It's what he's doing here. So we know why the enemy does what he does. But what exactly do the slaves do? If you read the parables, you'll notice, and this may be something to pay attention to as you go through the rest of these, a lot of times when Jesus has slaves speak in the parables, that's us. That's his audience speaking. That's his audience interpreting well or incorrectly what's going on. And I think the audience probably does. You probably feel pretty akin with the slaves in this case. They're like, listen, Jesus, to devote an entire field to destruction because of some seeds, doesn't that seem a little harsh? Doesn't that seem like overkill? You know, you're going to let the enemy ruin the entire harvest? You're going to let the righteous die along with the innocent? How many of us feel like destroying and burning down an entire field and all the crops because someone throws some extra seed in the ground seems ridiculous? Seems so sometimes to me. And here, the slaves speaking for those people say, wait a second. They offer to break the law, to counter this unfair situation, to counter the plots of the enemies. They said, what if we just uprooted the weeds? What if we just tried to destroy the wicked? And here the slaves seek to countermand the designs of the law and the designs of the enemy in the only way they know how. They seek to show grace and mercy to the innocent as best as they know how, to the greatest extent that they can imagine in their minds. And here again, I feel sympathy for them because that's the solution I would think of. Look, I know the law says this, but in this case, because of malicious intent, it's unfair. We need to try to fix it. We need to try to do things. And the law allows for those sorts of situations. Look, if it's the Sabbath, but your neighbor's donkey falls into the ground, that takes precedence. That is more important in this case. Here, do we need to let mercy triumph over sacrifice? And this is as far as they can go in the situation. But the master responds negatively. No, I don't want you to uproot the weeds. But Jesus, who perfectly keeps the law, does not respond with, because that would break the law. Instead, his negative response shows still greater concern for the innocent. He says, lest when gathering up even just the weeds, you should uproot some wheat as well. He commands further breaking of custom. Let both grow alongside each other until the harvest, at which point I will command the reapers to fulfill the command and the destiny of each. It's only after the wheat is gathered into the barn, then the field will be dedicated, then the field will be destroyed, then the field will be burnt. And only after the harvest then will this occur. Only then will the law given in Deuteronomy be fulfilled. So, we have hopefully answered the most important questions, I think, about the parable, but I do think we need to take just a few minutes here at the end to discuss something that is maybe less familiar than the parables. At least in my experience, and I get to have a few extra tidbits of this information. I get to teach the Law of Moses class every other year to a bunch of your kids, and some of them are in here now. And so I get a pretty good cross-section of like, hey, how much do we talk about the Law of Moses? What is our thought process and understanding when we read the law? And at least in my experience, we tend not to know exactly what to do with it. And that causes problems because that can lead us to ignore it or misread it or misapply it. But that doesn't just harm our reading of the law. It harms our reading of all Scripture because the law and assumptions about the law and understandings and mores about the law, like what we've seen here, it's present throughout the entire Bible. If you'll excuse the pun, it's often seeded in stories and parables from the Old Testament historical books to the Gospels to Paul's epistles. So then what do we think and take and understand about the law? Well, I think first we need to recognize the law was meant to be enduring, but not eternal. I think that's Paul's point in Galatians chapter 3. It's certainly inspired, as Jesus would say in Luke 24, or Paul would say in 2 Timothy chapter 3, because, of course, the all scriptures he's talking about being breathed out and inspired and teaching for reproof and correction. Y'all know the passage as well as I do. And for teaching about the Christ, he's not talking about the New Testament, which a lot of it hadn't been written yet. He's talking about what we would call the Old Testament. He's talking about the law as well, that these things teach about Christ. And Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 19 that the law is given because of the hardness of people's hearts, but it was meant to soften them. It's meant to put them into a trajectory which would eventually lead them to Christ. And a careful reading of the law shows that it could and was meant to change and evolve, to grow alongside the people. And it's indeed this purpose is intrinsic to Matthew, who has, of course, Jesus say over and over and over in the Sermon about, you have heard, but you should have realized. Hate your brother is the same as murder. You should have realized that's the case. And so in this parable, we see a connection of two things, that the law of Christ is different from the laws of men, just as the kingdom of heaven is different from the kingdoms of men. And in this parable, we see the two of them come together. Because Satan has always seen both the law and the kingdoms of men as things to be twisted and manipulated to his own twisted purposes. And by his actions and our failings, they both end up serving him. Satan twisted the law to make us sin more, and he twists the law in order to try to destroy God's people. It is Satan who stands to accuse Joshua the high priest in Zechariah chapter 3 of the sinfulness represented by his stained garments and the unworthiness he is to offer sacrifices to cleanse the temple before they can even cleanse the people. But just as there, the Lord rebukes the accuser and destroys his plans by cleansing his sins and cleaning his garments and plucking him like a brand from where? The fire of dedication. So too here does the Lord save his people from the fire. Because if we know who Satan is, and we've seen his actions from the beginning, I think that we will do disservice if we do not end by considering how God acted in each of those same places. Because in Genesis 3, when the entire story of the world doesn't end, God doesn't just drive the people from the garden into exile, but he gives them protection and he gives them a promise and a way to return to a better garden. In Genesis 6, God doesn't just destroy the wicked of the world, but he saves the righteous and even those kind of sort of around them. In Genesis chapters 18, 19, it doesn't just fire Sodom and Gomorrah, he brings Lot out. In Exodus chapter 32, and again in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, God doesn't destroy the people and start again with Moses. And in Habakkuk chapters 1 through 3, he makes it very clear that the righteous will live because of his own faith. This is what God is. This is what God does. And it's what he's doing here. It's what he does in our own lives as well. Again and again and again, God will not allow evil to triumph, let himself be manipulated or his people destroyed. Because thank God for that. Because as many of the other speakers have noted already, and many of the other speakers I'm sure will note in the future, too often we say, hey, we are the good wheat. But how often instead are we the weeds that God continues to give chances to repent rather than burning us down at the very moment that we sin? Here we have a parable of God's grace. Here we have a parable showing beyond any shadow of the doubt that God loves us and is long-suffering and desires us to do his will. On that, we are 5 minutes early, so you all can begin the rush to the lunch. I appreciate your time, and I hope that this has helped you understand the parables better.